We're ready to start with introductions. Oh,
I believe so. I think we're waiting on a judge, if that's all right.
yeah, I just saw that. Sorry.
No, you're good.
Hi there, guys. We are waiting for another judge. Is that correct? Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, yeah, that's correct.
Thank you.
All right, looks like we have all three judges here. All right, thank you all very much for your time, and I'd like to say a quick congratulations to the negative team in today's round for advancing to semifinals. Quite an accomplishment.
Congratulations to you guys too. Thank you.
All right, now I have information from Steve saying that Miss Baker is a community judge and she's watching the live stream. We'll do our best, Miss Baker, to keep everything clear and concise for you today's round. But Mrs. McDaniel, if I can have your past experience as a judge and also your preferences that we can adhere to in this round, that'd be wonderful.
Hi, I am relatively new to debate. As long as we adhere to the time frames, and please be as clear and organized as you can be.
All right. Yes, ma'am. Thank you very much for that. And our last judge, sir, if I could have your past experience and what we can do in this round.
Yeah, hi. I mean, it's same. I'm relatively new to the debate. I stay organized, and I'm expecting you guys are going to hold yourself accountable to the time allotted.
All right. Yes, sir. Thank you very much for that. And for all of the judges' reference, I'm Noah Reed. I'm going to be the affirmative constructive speaker in today's round. Thank you all very much for your time.
My name is Malachi Fry, and I'll be the affirmative rebuttal speaker in today's debate round. Thank you all so much for your time. Noah and I really do appreciate it.
My name is Claire Say. I will be the negative or constructive speaker. And yes, we really appreciate you offering your time to judge us.
And I'm Danielle Miller. I'll be your negative rebuttal speaker. And thank you to all my judges.
All right, so now that we got that all the way, I trust that we're all ready for the 6-minute constructive. All right, let's go ahead and kick this round off. It is health that is real wealth and not gold and silver. Now, this quote from Gandhi perfectly illustrates the affirmative philosophy and what we seek to achieve in today's round. We think that it isn't money that gives us our wealth, but it is rather public health that should be held first and foremost, and the preservation of American well-being specifically. That's why the affirmative is resolved that the United States federal government should implement a substantial new progressive tax. Again, the USFG should implement a substantial new progressive tax. Now, to get into the terms of this resolution, we first like to define progressive tax by thebalance.com in 2020 as, quote, a progressive tax imposes a higher rate on the rich than on the poor, and it's based on the taxpayer's income or wealth. So essentially what this is doing is imposes a tax on a higher rate of the income a certain individual or company has rather than on the lesser. That brings us to our harm of the status quo, or what's happening in the current system and how it damages us in general. You can tag that harm as environmental damage. Again, environmental damage. Our world is experiencing irreversible environmental devastation. Carbon emissions right now are growing rapidly, polluting the environment and compromising the health of us as individuals. The cost of carbon emissions have been politically and artificially repressed, and as a result, the monetary cost of those carbon emissions does not reflect the societal cost of those emissions, as we'll see in subpoint A of emissions devastate. Again, emissions devastate. The Tax Policy Center in 2018 said, quote, emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gases are increasing global temperatures, raising sea levels, shifting rainfall patterns, boosting storm intensity, and harming coral reefs and other marine lives. Greenhouse gas emissions that create a host of potential economic environmental threats, including property damage from storms, human health risks, and reduced agricultural productivity and economic deterioration. End quote. This brings us to subpoint B of energy prices don't match emission costs. Again, energy prices don't match the emission costs. Again, by the same source in 2018, so they said, quote, energy prices do not reflect those costs of greenhouse gas emissions. Those who benefit from burning fossil fuels generally do not pay for the environmental damage that the emissions cause. Instead, this cost is borne by people across the world, including future generations. Imposing a carbon tax can help to correct this externality, by raising the price of energy consumption to reflect more of its social cost, end quote. This brings us to our impact of national security. Again, national security. Our reliance on fossil fuels contributes to a less stable world, which empowers rogue petrostates and makes us vulnerable to a volatile world oil market. A transition to cleaner power sources could strengthen national security and America's energy independence, and that came from the council.org. This brings us to the impact, too, of lives lost. Again, lives lost. Each year, 4.2 million premature deaths occur due to outdoor air pollution caused by fossil fuels, end quote. And that was by CNN in 2019. This brings us to our plan, or to what is going to fix the harms that we have presented. Our plan is to implement a progressive carbon tax. Mandate 1 is to implement progressive carbon tax of $40 per ton on the top 20% of United States companies. Our agency and enforcement is the Congress, the President, the IRS, and any other needed bodies of the United States federal government. No funding is needed, seeing how the plan is to purely legislative, but any unforeseen costs will come from the United States General Fund. The plan will be passed immediately upon affirmative ballot, but it will take full effect by April of 2021. A carbon tax is exactly what it sounds like. It's a per ton tax on the carbon dioxide emissions embedded in fuels and other products. This brings us to a central advantage, actually two of them. Advantage 1 you can tag as $2.5 trillion in revenue. Again, $2.5 trillion in revenue. The Center on Global Energy Policy in 2018 said, quote, carbon tax revenue could be so potentially large as much as $2.5 trillion over the first 10 years, depending on the tax rate and the technological innovation in the United States economy, end quote. But more than that was solving our harms of advantage 2 of environment preserved. Again, environment preserved. Putting a tax on carbon emissions can drive efficient emission reductions, spur innovation, and allow businesses and households to choose how they reduce their emissions. That was by WRI.org back in 2018. But more than just preserving our environment and having that $2.5 trillion in extra revenue for our government, we need to be making sure that our plan will actually make a difference and will actually work. That's what we're going to get into with our solvency piece, which you can tag as empirical evidence. Again, empirical evidence. Specifically, what we're going to be talking about is whenever we have the harms in the current system and our plan to do it, then that we actually have empirical evidence and statistics that say that our plan is going to solve for those harms. The New York Times in 2019 said, quote, "More than 40 governments worldwide have now adopted some sort of price on carbon, either through direct taxes on fossil fuels or through cap and trade programs," end quote. So what we can see is that 40 governments worldwide acknowledge the problem exists in the current system and have implemented the affirmative team's plan to fix it. And this is exactly why the affirmative plan is needed at the end of the day. We have a pressing issue in the status quo that is not being addressed currently, but we're addressing it, and you can help us do that by voting for affirmative. Thanks.
This is a 3-minute cross-examination. You all ready?
I'm ready.
Let's get started. All right, I'm going to start off by asking you to put a couple of things in the chat. First of all, could we have a copy of your plan text?
Sure.
And
I'll
then,
take care of that.
cool. And then the piece of evidence from CNN about the lives lost, we'd appreciate that piece of evidence.
We'll get that as well.
All right. Oh, and then your definition of carbon tax.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Should you ever pass a policy you don't understand?
That depends on the situation.
Okay, so there are situations where you should pass a policy that you don't understand.
Well, sure. Whenever there's a pressing issue at hand, then you may not understand every single aspect of a plan. But if you have a general idea of what it's going to do and it's a pressing issue as such as this, then yes, you need to pass it.
Even if you don't understand what it's doing?
You don't have to understand every single part. I'd say that having a general understanding about what that plan will do is a good thing to have. Okay,
but you should have a general understanding.
A general understanding is not the same as knowing all of the integral parts of the plan.
Okay. The 2.5 trillion that you talked about in revenue, was that from a progressive or a regressive tax?
From a progressive tax.
Okay. Did it say a progressive tax in the evidence?
I believe it did, but I can look at it if you'd like me to.
All right. We'd really like that piece of evidence or for you to show us where it says a progressive carbon tax. Has any country ever implemented a progressive carbon tax, not a regressive carbon tax?
Yes, the 40 countries that I cited at the end of my speech had all put a progressive tax on their top companies.
A progressive tax or a progressive carbon tax?
A progressive carbon tax, sorry. We were speaking in the context of carbon tax, so I assumed that it would be that.
Okay. We'd also like that evidence. Sorry about all of the evidence requests. How important is it to pay off our debt?
Whenever it's a matter of money or human life, I'd say that it's not important.
Okay. If your plan costs more money to low-income people than high-income people, would you agree that it is non-topical?
Not necessarily, because we're looking at the tax itself, not necessarily the prices.
Okay. If your plan taxes low-income people more than high-income people, is your plan topical?
Well, that's an impossible situation since we're only taxing the top 20% of companies, but I would say
it's a hypothetical.
even though that's extremely hypothetical.
Okay, then no, it's not topical, if that was the case.
If in some alternate universe that was the case, yes, but that's it's impossible to do.
No further questions. And we'll be taking prep time, 4 minutes on the clock starting now.
No further prep time needed. We have 9 seconds left. We're here to debate a resolution. Our resolution that we've been given today is resolved. The United States federal government should implement a substantial new progressive tax. Today, I'd like to start off with some evaluation of our resolution, showing you, our judges, why both teams are negating the resolution today, why the affirmative team has not upheld the resolution because of the inherent nature of their plan. But then I will be going on to continue the debate for formality's sake and looking at some disadvantages of if the affirmative team's plan is passed, all of the bad things that will happen as a result. So I'd like to start off with some analysis of the resolution. It's called topicality. So in team policy debate, or in policy debate, Socratic policy debate here, we have a burden for the affirmative team to approve the resolution and for the negative team to negate the resolution. That's why we're given a resolution. You can write down my first point as standard, progressive. The standard that we'll be talking about in this debate round is the standard of the affirmative team's plan being a progressive tax. In order for them to uphold the resolution, they must implement a progressive tax. So there are two ways they have violated this standard. You can write down my first violation as doesn't increase. Doesn't increase. Now, according to the definition from US legal of what a progressive tax is, it says, quote, progressive tax refers to a tax by which the tax rate increases as a taxable base amount increases, end quote. So what this means is, for example, the most common example is federal income tax. The more money you make, the higher percentage of federal income tax you have to pay, the more money you make. That's progressive. It increases, the percentage of income tax increases the more money you make, the higher income that you have. The problem with the affirmative team's plan is, and this is their mandate one, implement progressive carbon tax of $40 per ton on the top 20% of US companies. See, the problem with this mandate is that we're only talking about one bracket. It's a flat tax for one group. We're not looking at a shifting scale like the federal income tax, which is what a progressive tax is. It doesn't increase. So there's no increase or decrease of this carbon tax based on the company's income or rankings. I would assume the US companies would be rated on their stock market value. That's unclear as to where exactly they're getting this top 20% from. But basically, their tax is not progressive because it doesn't increase over a scale. There's a second reason that this is a violation of this standard, that it has to be a progressive tax. You can write down the second violation as inherently regressive. Inherently regressive. So what this basically is, a regressive tax is where lower income people are impacted more, have to pay more tax than higher income people. Carbon taxes are inherently regressive taxes. Now, why? Well, because companies pass on all of their costs to their consumers. So these carbon tax will be passed on through these companies into everyday consumers. The problem with this is that lower income people who spend a higher proportion of their average income on everyday items will be more impacted by a carbon tax, which will filter through these large companies into everyday consumers. So it's inherently regressive rather than progressive because it will disproportionately affect low-income people and disproportionately not affect higher income people. So what is the impact of these two violations of the standard of having a progressive tax? The impact, you can write this down as burden. It is the fundamental burden of the affirmative team to uphold the resolution. That's why we have a resolution. in today's debate round, both teams have agreed that the resolution is false. Therefore, I would urge a negative ballot. On top of that, I'd like to bring up 2 disadvantages in closing. My first disadvantage, financially devastating. Carbon taxes are financially devastating. I'd like to prove this with my first subpoint you can write down as past precedent, Australia. According to the Wall Street Journal in July of 2014, quote, Virginia Australia Holdings Limited said it lost $27 million in the 6 months through December 2013 due to the carbon tax, saying it couldn't pass costs on to passengers because of stiff market competition. It reported a first half loss of $83 million, end quote. So in Australia, it's been known to significantly shut down businesses because they're unable to make their product or their service financially feasible with all of this added cost on top. According to the Institute for Energy Research in September of 2013, quote, in the year after Australia's carbon tax was introduced, household electricity prices rose 15%, including the biggest quarterly increase on record. The job market had previously been stable, but after Australia's carbon tax, the number of unemployed workers has risen by more than 10%. End quote. What this means is that the carbon tax implemented in Australia was financially devastating. The carbon tax is a regressive tax that hurts everyday citizens. It hurts the companies by making their products or services not financially feasible, and it without some way of using the revenue or having some other counterbalance to help allay the impact of a tax like this, it will be financially devastating. You can write down my second subpoint as COVID. Now, the timeline for their plan is it will be passed immediately and it will have full effect by April. What this means is that just as we're getting out of this huge global pandemic, we're going to be implementing this financially devastating carbon tax. We simply cannot afford to implement this, particularly not right now. There is the highest unemployment we've seen in record times. Many people are in a bad financial position simply because of a global pandemic, something they cannot control. This is definitely not the time to be adding more burdens to people, including struggling companies, by making their products and their services less financially feasible. Thank you.
All right, if you're ready for cross-examination.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and get started. Should public health be preserved?
Yes.
All right, whenever it comes to money or human life, which is more important?
Well, money influences human life, so it depends on what situation.
Okay,
generally, human life is more important, but money can play a role in protecting human life.
Okay, so are greenhouse gases generally good or bad for the environment?
Bad. Sorry.
Okay, so they're generally bad for the environment.
Oh no.
If we go ahead and pause here real quick. His Wi-Fi has dropped 1 or 2 times this tournament, so we'll just try and give him a second to reconnect, if that's okay with you guys. All right, perfect.
No, it's totally fine.
All right, can y'all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. I might need to keep my camera off for a little bit so my Wi-Fi can catch up, if that's all right. Anyway, I stopped the timer at 1 minute and 44 seconds. Is that okay?
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, thanks. Okay, resuming cross-examination. Are we raising taxes on companies or individuals?
You're directly raising taxes on companies, but you're effectively raising the prices of everything those companies produce or make for individuals.
Okay, sure. Now, where in your evidence did it say that the $40 tax that we would put per ton on these companies would directly raise tax or raise prices of goods?
That's pretty logical. Companies pass on all of their costs to their consumers.
Do they pass on all of their costs to their consumers or some?
I would say all of their costs that I'm aware of.
Okay. Now, where in your evidence does it say that the consumers directly because of the $40 tax will be harmed?
I think that's just a logical point I was making. If you have higher costs, I have read some evidence about Australia. So the higher costs of everything these companies are making, or
okay, so in
giving
other
to people,
words,
or the services.
It's your assumption that prices will be raised, not actually proved empirically.
That's a pretty logical point in how economics and business works.
Okay. Now, with the Australia tax, which is the only evidence that you cited regarding this issue, how much was the tax that they had to pay?
I believe the usual is $20 per ton. I'm not 100% sure what Australia's particularly was, but
okay,
somewhere in that range, I believe.
All right, we'll go ahead and start affirmative team prep time at 4 minutes beginning now. Really quick, did you guys read a definition of progressive?
Yes, I did. Would you like me to share that?
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, stopping prep time at 1 minute and 20 seconds used. Let me write that down and we'll go ahead and get started. All right. This is a 5-minute rebuttal speech. If we're all ready, let's go ahead and begin. One of the key factors of policy debate is evidence. Your arguments must be logical, but then backed by evidence. When we look at the negative team and the claims that they have made, they fail to do just that. So throughout today's speech, it is my goal and ultimately my duty to run through the arguments and explain why the affirmative team has better arguments and ultimately why they'll have better impacts on the world and what happens after we pass our plan. So let's go ahead and start off with the topicality press. The topicality press was simply tagged as untopical, and they gave 2 reasons. First, they gave a standard of progressive. And then they talked about how it doesn't increase and how we're not actually increasing the amount of money per how much money that the company or individual is making. I have 2 responses to their first standard or subpoint under this topicality. My first response you can write down as rich get taxed. Again, rich get taxed. If you refer back to our definition of progressive tax, we said that, quote, a progressive tax imposes a higher rate on the rich than on the poor. What we see is that through the affirmative team's plan, we impose a progressive tax because we tax the top 20% of carbon companies that are using carbon. What this means is that those top 20% of companies are going to change their ideas for how they essentially move their items, etc. So they'll change so that they don't have to deal with this carbon tax. And I'll get into why that's important in a little bit. But my second response you can write down is that of company, not individual. Company, not individual. Now, here's why you should pick the affirmative team's definition over the negative team's. The negative team's definition is specifically looking at a progressive tax when it's implemented on an individual's scale. For example, implemented per each person in a family or over a family specifically. We're dealing with companies in this scenario. This is a progressive tax, a progressive carbon tax that we're implementing on companies and not an individual progressive tax like the stereotypical one. The affirmative team's definition provides that basis for a overall company progressive tax rather than a specific individual. The affirmative or negative team's definition is regarding individuals and not companies. This is why our definition is important. Moving down, their second point was talking about how it was inherently regressive. I have two responses. My first response is that of all claims, no evidence. All claims, no evidence. The negative team is making all claims here with no evidence. However, they claim that there is some logic behind it. So my second response you can write down here is that of market shrinks. Again, market shrinks. If what the negative team says is true, then the carbon market will shrink, solving the affirmative team's harms, which is what we want. And keep in mind, in cross-examination, they said public health is more important than money, and lives are more important than money. There are other alternatives to carbon that we can use to keep all the same money, and everybody would still be earning the same money that they do now in the status quo, as well as we save lives. And that is what will happen with the affirmative team's plan. According to Vox Media, they write that, quote, theoretically, carbon taxes can achieve any level of emission reduction. Just crank the price up, change the model inputs until you get the outputs you need. End quote. The Tax Policy Center writes that, quote, emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are changing the climate. A carbon tax puts a price on those emissions, encouraging people, businesses, and governments to produce less of them. End quote. What we see is that when we have used carbon taxes in the past in other countries and in the United States itself, carbon emissions decrease, therefore protecting and preserving our climate. And this is extremely important. Moving down to their one and only disadvantage. They tagged it as financially devastating. I have three responses to the overall disadvantage regarding their subpoints as well. My first response you can write down is 40 other countries. 40 other countries. They read one piece of evidence that talked about one specific business. We cited 40 other countries that have implemented this carbon tax without any harms. My second response is that of lives lost. Again, lives lost. In the current status quo, lives are being lost daily because of the climate in the United States and in countries surrounding and in other places around the world. The reality is that our climate today is costing life. We must take action to stop that. My third response is that of other technology. Again, other technology. If the negative team claims that all these businesses are going to be harmed because carbon emissions and specifically carbon is just going to go down the drain and everybody won't use it anymore, the reality is that we've seen it happen in other countries, but companies will change their strategy so that they're not using carbon anymore and they're using other forms of transportation or however they are using their carbon emissions. So we see is if we vote for the affirmative team's plan, we can not only help businesses, but we will also save lives. Thank you.
I have 2 minutes on the clock for cross-examination starting now. If big oil companies had to pay $1 billion more for each company, would oil prices go up or down?
Sorry, what was that? If big oil companies paid $1 million for each company?
Yeah, so if each company had to pay $1 billion more, would oil prices go up or down?
It really depends on the situation, but it would reasonably assume that in some scenarios the prices would go up.
So in some scenarios, the prices would go down?
Yeah, well, for example, there's the edge of competitiveness in the business world that I'm sure we're all familiar with. But in competitiveness, if one company's oil prices are much higher than another company's oil prices, then they will start to lower their prices to match the rest of the world or the other companies that are lower than them. That way they have their product being bought more, even if it costs them money in some scenarios to do so.
Can companies operate at a loss for very long?
Our federal government has done
Generally.
it for multiple years, so I would say yeah.
Is our federal government a company?
You could say that. In a lot of aspects, they are. They have a bunch of different branches, and they're $24 trillion in debt, yet they operate fine, essentially, now.
So our federal government operates just like any other big business.
They're a much bigger business than a lot of other companies. I can't think of a company that's like close to their size, but they operate pretty well. There are a lot of insufficiencies in their government, but I mean, they're functioning well, and the United States is doing somewhat okay.
So just to confirm, the federal government is very similar to Exxon or Johnson & Johnson or any other big company?
I wouldn't say exactly similar, but they have a somewhat of a same model.
Okay. And is it your contention that there is no economic harm to any of the other 40 countries that implemented the carbon tax?
Sorry, you can go ahead and ask the question again. I kind of missed that because the timer was blocking out your voice for me for some reason.
Okay, sorry. Is it your contention that there is absolutely no economic harm to any of the other 40 countries that implemented the carbon tax?
I'm sure there's economic harm because of COVID, but there wasn't economic harm because of the carbon tax.
Thank you.
All right, no prep time needed. Okay. All right, this is a 5-minute speech. So we'll jump right in. If the resolution we were given today was just talking about instituting a new tax, then the affirmative team would be absolutely within it. The problem is that they're talking about that today we're talking about a progressive tax, and the affirmative team has not presented one of those to you. My first response to their topicality responses were agree with definition. We agree. We agree with their definition. They failed on both definitions. The only reason we provided another definition was just to further clarify what's going on, to give you some more specifics. But they also failed their own definition, which was taxing the rich at a higher rate than they tax the poor. They are only taxing on one rate. If you look at their plan, it says $40 per ton of carbon on the top 20% of US companies. That is a flat rate tax. That is not a progressive tax. Progressive taxes are very complicated, and they involve taxing at different rates for higher income brackets. This is not what the affirmative team is doing. And you can write down my second response as only one rate. Only one rate. The affirmative team has failed their own definition by only providing one rate. The definition of taxing the rich at a higher rate than the poor implies that there are two different rates, and they've only given you one. They clearly violate this resolution, and thus you cannot vote for them. But we're still going to try to continue this debate by bringing up some other arguments. So I'm going to talk about what he talked about in his last speech with his disadvantages and solvency arguments. So first of all, he talked about how the carbon market would shrink. You can write down my response as useless without global effort. Useless without global effort. Now, I completely agree that global warming is a problem, and it's hurting people's health. But it is a global problem, and it requires global cooperation. On our own, the United States cannot influence this enough to actually help save any lives. They read you numbers about the lives that were being lost right now, but they never read you any numbers about how many of those lives they would be saving. Our air isn't in a bubble over the United States. We get all of the pollution from China and India, and that contributes to global warming just as much as our own does. And I'd actually like to read you a piece of evidence about this. And this is from Jonathan A. Lesser, an energy industry consultant and PhD in economics from the Manhattan Institute in 2018. And he says, quote, "The US doesn't need a carbon tax. And even if it imposed one, it wouldn't make a difference to global climate. In 2017, US carbon emissions were around 5,100 billion metric tons from all sources, at almost 20% drop below emissions in 2007. While US greenhouse gas emissions have been falling in recent years, world carbon emissions keep increasing. Driven primarily by China's and India's increasing demand for energy. China and India are not going to impose a carbon tax on themselves. Neither will Russia, nor countries in the Middle East, nor developing nations whose primary concern is improving the economic well-being of their citizens. End quote. That was a long quote, but basically what that economic PhD was talking about is that we cannot change the problem of global warming on our own because we are such a small percentage of the world's global pollution and emissions. Global warming is not like low-level pollution of like breathing in coal smoke. It's about a world effort, and we cannot change this on our own. Thus, you will not see the harms that the affirmative team presented to be solved at all. Next, he talked about a response to our disadvantage, saying we only brought up the example of Australia. So I'd like to give you some more general evidence about this, how this will decimate our economy. This is from the Congressional Budget Office in May of 2013, and it says, quote, the costs of a carbon tax would not be evenly distributed among U.S. households. For example, the additional cost from higher prices would consume a greater share of income for low-income households than for high-income households, because low-income households generally spend a larger percentage of their income on emission-intensive goods, end quote. This is going to be harming the American economy and especially the low-income households that are being decimated by COVID right now. This is not a problem that we can fix, and when we try to fix it, we're going to bring about more disadvantages than advantages. Which brings me to my final response to his other technology point, which you can write down as renewables already skyrocketing. Renewables already skyrocketing. I just Googled this, and the top 2 fastest growing jobs, according to USA Today, are a solar photovoltaic installer and a wind turbine technician. The 2 fastest growing jobs in America. The free market is taking care of us. The free market is promoting renewables already. We don't need a carbon tax to do this for us. Thank you.
All right, 2 minutes of cross-examination if you're ready.
Already.
Let's go ahead and get started. Which is more, $40 or $0?
I missed the last one, sorry.
Which is more, $40 or $0?
$40.
Okay, so in the context of our plan, we are taxing the companies more than smaller companies, correct?
The definition that you read said at a larger rate, which is a percentage. So because you're not taxing at 2 separate rates and you're only taxing at 1 flat rate, it's not a progressive tax.
Well, does the resolution mandate us tax at a rate?
The resolution mandates a progressive tax, which is a tax at a rate considering your income bracket and increasing through each income bracket with different rates for each bracket of that income. So these companies aren't even in income brackets. It's completely unrelated to a progressive tax.
Okay. You would agree that 40 countries have implemented progressive carbon taxes, correct?
No. 40 countries have implemented carbon taxes, but not progressive taxes.
Okay, let me ask you a question again, kind of backing up a little bit. If 80% of companies don't have a carbon tax put on them, and then the top 20% does, that's still an increase from $0 to $40, correct?
Yes, but that's not what a progressive tax is.
Progressive taxes have to consistently increase.
I missed your last question. Could you repeat that?
Contention that progressive taxes have to keep increasing over time.
Over time? No, progressive taxes increase for each income bracket. I believe they also increase over time. It's a very complicated system, but it's not a flat rate like $40 per ton.
Okay, thanks. No further questions.
All right, starting affirmative team prep time, beginning now. All right, stopping prep time. 1 minute and 20 seconds remaining. This is a 4-minute speech. If everybody's ready. All right, perfect. Let's go ahead and begin. In this speech, we're going to go through the arguments. Most importantly, we're going to talk about topicality and the definition that still stands in today's debate round. And ultimately, we're going to bring it back to the disadvantages and a few other responses. So let's go ahead and start off with the topicality. In response to topicality, they first started off by agreeing with both definitions. I'd like to point out that they dropped my rhetoric specifically looking at why their definition was flawed. So the only definition that remains in today's debate round is the affirmative team's definition. I specifically talked about how their definition was specific to individuals and not companies. Their definition has no more weight in today's debate round, seeing as the affirmative team has no more speeches to respond to dropped arguments, except for the last statement, which is used for voting issues. So let's go and look at our definition and their critiques for why we do not fall under our definition. They talked about a flat rate, and then it was only one rate. I have 3 responses. My first response is that of 0% interest rate. Again, 0% interest rate. You can have a 0% interest rate on a loan. It's not very likely, nor do companies ever issue it really, but it does exist, which means that you can have an interest rate of 0. My second response is that of 2 rates. Companies below the 80% of the top wealthy are not going to be charged any tax on their carbon fees. However, companies above the 20% are going to have a $40 tax. This gives you 2 rates you can work with, the $0 tax and the $40 tax. These are 2 very different rates, as the negative team even agreed in cross-ex. $0 is a rate. Let's go and move down into the second response, looking at how it was inherently regressive. And they talked about how it's useless without a global effort in response to my market shrinks. First, I'd like to point out that they still haven't provided evidence saying how the lower income people would be affected, except for they did under the DA, but it wasn't our plan. So I'll get into why that's important later on. But under this, they said it was useless without a global effort. I have 3 responses. My first response is that of 196,000 in US. 196,000 in US. There are 196,000 deaths each year in the United States. If we implement a carbon tax, we can solve for at least a portion of those deaths. We might not be able to solve for all of the deaths around the world, the deaths in China because of pollution and the climate change, but we can solve for the deaths in the United States. And this is extremely important. Remember, Negative said that the human life is the most important thing in today's debate round. My second response you can write down is step in the right direction. Again, step in the right direction. We can't solve for all of the climate problems in today's world, but we can take a step in the right direction on putting a carbon tax on the top 20% of countries. Moving down to DA1, they talked about how it was harming low-income housing, and specifically it would harm lower-income families. I have 2 responses. My first response is that of not our plan. Again, not our plan. The negative team has said that our evidence is bad because it's not talking about progressive or regressive taxing. But when we specifically look at the evidence they read, it wasn't even talking about the affirmative team's plan. It's not talking about implementing a carbon tax on the top 20% of companies, but rather implementing a carbon tax, period. If the negative team is going to be picky about evidence, then the standards should apply to them as well. Let's go and move down into the second response, talking about other technology in response to the disadvantage one. The response was that of renewable energy is skyrocketing. Again, renewable energy is skyrocketing. My first response is that of full economy. Again, full economy. Some companies have already taken a step in the right direction towards renewable energy. But what we're doing is making it so that these big companies that lead innovation in the United States are also going to be taking a step in the right direction towards renewable energy, and how that is skyrocketing. That's a good thing for us. We see that in my second response is that of turn to renewable energy. Again, turn to renewable energy. Carbon tax is going to get expensive. We read evidence saying how that's a good thing. People are going to turn to renewable energy. This is exactly what we want. We need to protect our climate, and we need to save human lives. Thank you so much.
I have 1 minute on the clock for my cross-examination, starting now.
All right, thank you.
If your plan is not a progressive tax, should you lose?
I don't see a world where that's a scenario because our plan is a progressive tax, but if we are untopical, then yes, the judges should vote for negative.
How would you define a flat rate tax?
I actually don't know how I personally would define a flat rate tax. I would say that there's in the scenario we're given right now, there's two different taxes. So there's no tax provided to the
So,
lower
just a second.
economies,
That's
and then
okay.
there's a tax to. Sorry, go ahead.
Just in one sentence, what's a flat rate tax?
I already told you that I didn't know how I would personally define that, but I would say like maybe if we added like a 10-cent gas tax,
Okay,
just in general to everybody,
that's
not a
okay.
specific group.
Okay. Do companies pass on their costs to consumers?
In some scenarios, yes.
Thank you.
Eight seconds of prep time remaining, and we're just going to use that. All right, no further prep time remaining, and this is a 4-minute speech. This will be the last negative speech of the round. So let's go ahead and get started. In this last negative speech, I'm only going to be talking about exactly what matters to your vote, instead of going down and responding to every argument that you just heard in that speech. And I'll be bringing this up through 3 voting issues. You can write down my first voting issue as regressive tax. Regressive tax. Now, in their last speech, they talked about how they would have 2 rates, a $0 tax and a $40 tax per ton on the top 20% of companies. This is how we define a regressive tax, where there's just one rate. A progressive tax is when there are 2 rates on 2 different companies. Now, you could say that 0% and $40 are different rates, but that's just not how we would deal with them in the definitions. The definition that we brought up was talking about individuals, and that's because a progressive tax is only applied to individuals and not applied to companies. It's what depends on which tax bracket you're in. Companies aren't in tax brackets the same way as individuals are. Progressive taxes simply aren't applied to companies. A progressive carbon tax has never been applied before, and you will never hear the affirmative team be able to bring up a piece of evidence talking about a progressive carbon tax, because it's simply never been done, and it's not what we do with carbon taxes. They proposed a regressive tax today, no matter what they try to tell you. A $40 per ton tax on the top 20% of companies is regressive, and they have therefore failed topicality, and by their own concession, they should lose. The second voting issue you can write down as 0 lives saved. 0 lives saved. Now, in their last speech, they talked about, sure, we can save US lives, even though we can't save lives overseas. I would like to have some clarifying points under this. You can write my subpoint A as world pollution causes US deaths. World pollution causes US deaths. So the point I was trying to make was not that we're causing deaths overseas, it was that other countries cause deaths in the US. Global warming is a global problem. It's not like localized pollution, which means pollution in China affects the United States just as much as United States pollution does in regards to global warming. So we are talking about US deaths here, and my second subpoint you can write down as carbon tax has no impact. Carbon tax has no impact. And this piece of evidence, as the affirmative team pointed out to you, was actually talking about a carbon tax on everyone, not just the top 21%. And even if we had this carbon tax on everyone in the US, it would still have 0 impact on the health of these citizens. It would be such a small decrease in the global pollution that it wouldn't impact health at all. This was the piece of evidence that I read to you from an expert saying that there would be 0 impact. We would not notice it at all. This means 0 lives saved and no quantifiable advantage for the affirmative team. We are not saving any lives in the US or elsewhere without the cooperation of China and India and Russia and all of the other big polluters who are polluting much more than the United States is. And my final voting issue, you can write down as not in a global pandemic. Not in a global pandemic. Even if this is something that should be implemented, it shouldn't be implemented now in the middle of a global pandemic. This is a long-term policy that is going to hurt us a lot when it's first implemented. And if there are advantages in the future, they would be in decades into the future. This is something that needs to be implemented when we're in a good economic position, not when we're suffering from a global pandemic where every cent counts and every cent needs to be spent on promoting the economy and promoting public health from COVID. The affirmative team's plan will not affect public health, and it will actually take this money away from what we are trying to do with solving our public health problems and our economic problems in the middle of a global pandemic. For all these reasons, I urge you to vote against a carbon tax. Thank you.
All right, we'll be starting affirmative team prep time, beginning now.
I'm sorry, did you say prep time or cross? Because I believe there's a cross here.
Oh, my bad. Okay, let's go ahead and begin that. All right, when you're ready?
Already.
All right, perfect. Let's go ahead and begin. All right, specifically, did you respond to my critiques of your definition in your first affirmative or first negative rebuttal?
In our first negative rebuttal.
Yeah.
Well, we said that both definitions applied and that ours was more specific.
Yeah. Did you respond to my specific critiques in the first negative rebuttal, though?
Your critiques about it only being about individuals?
Yes.
I don't think that was a valid critique because that's simply what the definition is, and it means that your definition doesn't apply to companies.
Interesting. You agreed to our definition, right?
Oh, yes, I agree that your definition is valid, but our definition is
All right,
just
perfect.
as
So
valid
where in
as
our
the
definition does it
companies.
say that a progressive tax can't be implemented on companies?
Oh, it doesn't. Your definition is a valid definition and just doesn't give us all the details
Okay.
that our definition
Does it say
That's
it
why
must?
we need both.
Does it say that a progressive tax must be on an individual?
Your definition?
Yeah.
Your definition was just one sentence. It didn't give us much detail, so no.
Okay. Thank you so much. All right. Resuming prep time. We use about 20 seconds before cross-examination. So 1 minute beginning now.
All right, no further prep time needed. Assuming that we're all ready for this 2-minute affirmative statement. All right, let's go ahead and get started. There are two worlds which you can choose to vote for or choose to live in today. The first is the affirmative world, which actually takes a step in the right direction of trying to solve a problem that both sides have agreed existed. Then there's the negative world where we keep on the current trajectory and don't do anything about it and basically let our environment ruin. Because I believe that I think that we can all agree that the affirmative world actually does something about the current situation, then affirmative ballot is warranted. But that said, I want to look into 4 main voting issues of why the affirmative garners your ballot, starting off with voting issue number 1 of topicality. Again, topicality. Now, as the most important issue in this round, I'm going to be setting a bit of time on this. Subpoint A under this is progressive tax. Again, progressive tax. Essentially, what they keep on arguing is that since we're not increasing the tax on a specific bracket of people over time, then it doesn't apply. I'd like to point you back to the cross-examination where I asked her if 40 is greater than 0. She said yes. The $40 per ton of carbon emission tax would only apply to the top 20% of the United States companies. We can't jurisdict all over all of the individual citizens in the United States because simply we can't prep that in 30 minutes for a debate round. But we can do that with companies, and companies have the greatest effect on the environment, as we can see. This brings us to the impact of upheld. Again, upheld. We are increasing the tax for this particular brackets from $0 to $40, depending on the size of the company, so we are topical. Voting issue number 2, and I think I may end it here because I'm running out of time, is life more important. Again, life more important. Regardless of any financial burden that may be caused because of this carbon tax, life in the end is more important, and both sides have agreed to this. This brings us to the impact of cleaner alternatives. Again, cleaner alternatives. In fact, it's kind of a turn argument on all of the negative statements because it's saying that since we do have these cleaner alternatives that we do have, the incentive to use those cleaner alternatives is provided by putting a tax on the carbon emissions. In fact, this will help human life and the economy by creating new sector jobs. So in the end, I think an affirmative ballot is warranted because the affirmative actually does something about the current situation. Thank you for your time today.
Great round, you guys. Thank you to all of our judges.
Yes, thank you all.
Thank you all.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much for taking the time to judge us. Have a good rest of your day, guys. Later.
You too.
You too.